My name is Adi Goldberg, and this is the West Coast edition of this series. I am a Musar student, I am a Madrika, and I also am the newest of the board members for CCM. And so I'm tasked with some of the logistical things. Many of you have been with us before, and so it'll feel like a repetition for you. But for those of you who may not have tuned into the earlier sessions, I just want to go over a couple of logistical things. First thing is we're in the webinar format, which is different than some of the typical Zoom meetings that you may have had in the past, which means you don't get to see everybody on the screen. And it also means that the chat function has been disabled. But that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. The questions from the previous weeks have just been robust and deep, and we've been very, very grateful to hear from you. And so there is a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen that you can type in any questions that you have. And if you're like me and you sort of have a middle-aged brain, you might want to type them in when you think of them, because sometimes you might forget them. But that doesn't mean we'll be answering them in real time. We'll do as best as we can to cluster them and to spend time with Rabbi as oh, okay, there was a question right away, which I will respond to. We will get to all your questions tonight. I just also wanted to let you know that we'll be talking about the website. There was a request to know about previous sessions, and at the end I'll mention it again, but also if you look in your chat function, our administrator can answer some of those questions. You can go on contemporarymusar.org, and there is an archives there where you can see all the other weeks that we've been together. So that having been said, I want to briefly introduce Rabbi Joshua Boettiger. I have to tell you that he is coming here under a great cloud of smoke and blessing. It's epic Torah proportions, but the West Coast is on fire, and part of where it is on fire is in southwestern Oregon, which is where Rabbi comes from. So we are doing our best to make sure that we can make this as seamless as possible. I know that Rabbi Stone is going to be doing a lovely introduction, and all I can say is Rabbi has been my teacher, my colleague. He was the rabbi when I was the temple president. We have hatched many schemes together, and probably the one thing that Rabbi Stone does not know about him that won't be in his introduction is that if you ever catch him on Purim, he will do a mean breakdance. So with that, Rabbi Stone.
Thank you, Adi, and welcome and good evening to all of you again tonight. We're so thrilled that you're back with us for this penultimate session. We've had some wonderful Torah over the last 4 or 5 weeks, and as I'm sure some of you will know, we've been working our way through the Unatoneh Tokef prayer of the High Holiday Ritual, and Rabbi Joshua Boettiger will be talking about the last phrase, the enigmatic phrase in that prayer, that is the ability to avert the decree. I know Joshua since he was my student at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. He now serves as senior rabbi of Temple Emek Shalom for the past 8 years. In conjunction with the Center for Contemporary Musar, he runs the Musar program there, which has really exploded. We have 7 ongoing VODs in the Emek Shalom community. That is 7 separate independent Musar groups. And we have raised up 4 teachers that have been trained out of that community. So it's really been a hot spot. I hate to use that term for so many reasons these days, but for our Musar program. He's also involved with Jewish meditation. He teaches twice a year, or co-teaches at a meditation residential retreat. As I mentioned, he was ordained by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in 2006, where we first met. And Joshua was amongst those students who learned Musar with me at the college. And closer to my heart in many ways, if it's possible to say that, is the fact that Joshua also earned a master's in fine art in poetry from Pacific University in 2018, and has taught poetry at Southern Oregon University's Young Artist Institute through the Oregon Poetry Association. And as most of you will know, it is my contention that in order to deeply understand the texts of our tradition, one must be able to enter them in the spirit of poetry. I think no one does it better than Rabbi Joshua Boettiger, and I am anxious with all of you to listen to him teach tonight.
Thanks, Rabbi Stone. Thank you, Adi. Good to be with all of you. And I want to just echo what Adi said by way of an apology for what might be poor Wi-Fi. We'll see. We really are the town that our synagogue is in Ashland, Oregon. We're really besieged. There's big fires all around. So it's sort of a minor miracle that we have electricity, that there's some Wi-Fi area that's working well enough. So I hope you'll bear with us in terms of being with the uncertainty perhaps of the connection. But in that spirit, maybe in a deeper way, it's traditional to dedicate learning in Judaism. And I really want to dedicate the learning to all those really up and down the West Coast, California, Oregon, our community. We have congregants who we know have lost homes, just for those who have been displaced, for their well-being, for their healing. Dedicate also just with a sense of gratitude to the firefighters and the community who's pulling together in a lot of ways. In some ways, it feels appropriate to be speaking about Unatoneh Tokef in the midst of the intensity and craziness of this season, which I think is true no matter where we are, wherever we're joining this webinar from. So what I want to do, I want to begin by sharing the screen and inviting you to join me in a blessing before Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kirishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, our text of study over these past weeks has been the central High Holy Day prayer, which is recited on both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Unatoneh Tokef, as Rabbi Stone was mentioning. We've been looking at it together through a Musar lens. And I would say Unatoneh Tokef is central in terms of the liturgy of the season, but it's also representative of that liturgy. And I think no doubt there's many threads and themes that run through the High Holy Days. But to me, somehow Unatoneh Tokef feels like a concentrated dose of the season. It has a compressed intensity as a prayer. It brings us eye to eye with our sense of mortality. It brings us eye to eye with our uncertainty, however that manifests and is manifesting for us. And really eye to eye with this question, leading into this question of if we have any semblance of control over our shared lives. And I feel like that's true always. It always is that. And each year, maybe we feel it's particularly true this year. What better prayer, what more troubling prayer, what more beguiling and powerful prayer in 2020 in what will be 5781 than the Unatoneh Tokef. So the severe decree, right, I'm going to be working with a very intense title, right, Averting the Severe Decree. The severe decree that the prayer refers to is death. And even though the heart of the prayer frames it in the context of the coming year, mi yechyeh u'mi yamut, who will live and who will die. For me, the first step of meeting this prayer more poetically is to zoom out even further and to say the obvious, that of course in the broader picture, forget this year, in the broader picture, none of us will avert the severe decree. right? From the vantage point of wanting to preserve the individual person, it's not going to end well. This ship is going to sink. And it could be this year, and it could be many years from now, but one day it will be otherwise. And it's that spirit, and I think that word otherwise, I want to kind of bookend my session with that word and invite us. We're going to start by looking at Jane Kenyon, the late Jane Kenyon's poem by that same name. I got out of bed on 2 strong legs. It might have been otherwise. I ate cereal, sweet milk, ripe, flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. I took the dog uphill to the birchwood. All morning I did the work I love. At noon I lay down with my mate. It might have been otherwise. We ate dinner together at a table with silver candlesticks. It might have been otherwise. I slept in a bed in a room with paintings on the walls and planned another day just like this day. But one day I know it will be otherwise. So even though when she wrote this, Jane Kenyon was indeed in the throes of a diagnosis that would eventually take her life, to me, the poem's power is in the poet addressing this to all of us, regardless of our current health status, our age, our situation in life. The fact that one day it will be otherwise is obvious, but what does it mean to live into that knowledge? And I think this is the key here for Unatoneh Tokef through a Musar lens. What does it mean to live into that knowledge that one day it will be otherwise in a way that doesn't shut us down or make us unavailable to each other or cause us to merge with our anxieties? What does it mean to live into the knowledge that one day it will be otherwise in a way that actually brings us towards the other, as Rabbi Boettiger said a few weeks ago, towards responsibility? Because often if we do succeed in bushwhacking through our tangle of distractions and strategies of avoidance, truly facing our mortality results often in our retreating and going into self-preservation mode. And practicing Musar, I've seen this for myself. I see this in myself all the time. I've seen how my dread and anxiety directly impact my relationships with those around me. Simply put, I become less responsible, less present. The examples are endless. I'm sure we all would have endless examples. When I get worried, right, checking my news feed and ignoring my daughter, if I'm concerned about a health challenge or a concern on that front, I'll feel like I don't have the energy to engage with my wife until the crisis is resolved. But the thing that Unatoneh Tokef reminds us of is that it's never resolved, right? There's always something in the queue, in the line, ready to take its place. So when we practice Musar, which in many ways is a mindfulness practice, we see that there's a cost to our neuroses. The late Ram Dass used to say, we need to become connoisseurs of our neuroses. Not connoisseurs in that we celebrate them, but we just know them so well. We become intimate with our neuroses. And I'll explain the translation there with Musar in a moment. But essentially, we see that it's not just me who suffers from them. And whereas previously I might have said, well, this is just my personality or my history, or what do you want from me? The world's a scary place. Musar holds us accountable, hopefully with a lot of compassion, and says we can have more control over our inner mood, our inner landscape than we imagine that we can. Another way of naming this or of translating what Ram Dass said, Musar asks us to live into the knowledge that one day it will be otherwise for us and our loved ones without giving that knowledge over to the Yetzer Hara, which is really, really hard not to do. And as was taught in previous sessions, the Yetzer Hara is defined as that impulse, that necessary impulse to self-preservation, self-protection. It's a natural and important tendency that we have no desire to get rid of in Judaism. It's necessary in this world. But when we practice Musar, we see pretty quickly that it's our habitual default stance, even when there's no danger. And so this natural tendency for self-protection turns into a general state of self-absorption. And most beginning Musar work, although it continues, as many of you who have practiced this for years know, it's just about becoming conscious of the Yetzer Hara and how it manifests itself. And it's going to be idiosyncratic and different for each of us, but I would imagine that for many of us, when we confront the kind of things that the Unatoneh Tokef asks us to confront, right, the Yetzer Hara flares up and takes over. So I would say life wants to flow through us, but the Yetzer Hara, you could think of it this way too, it tightens and constricts this flow. The Yetzer HaTov, on the other hand, is the impulse towards serving the other. That's the impulse towards love and curiosity. It could also be defined as what happens when we allow that flow. And initially with Musar, there can be this impulse to try to get better, to just be a better person by further building up the ego, by taking on more and more, by trying really hard to be good. And there's a beautiful learning that yes, practice is necessary, but our natural state, not constricted by the Yetzer Hara, is one of Tov. We don't have to generate all this energy. In Ashland, we like using the metaphor from CCM of the faucet. You know, that life wants to come through us, but we have to turn on the faucet to allow it to come through. So if the Unatoneh Tokef prayer asks us to respond to the fundamental human truth of our impermanence, Musar challenges and invites us to respond with our Yetzer HaTov. So I want to look at the prayer itself, but that was sort of an on-ramp into looking at the prayer. And I want to pause now just in case there's any initial questions or anything that anyone wants to raise.
So far, there haven't been any questions, Rabbi. So if you want to proceed, I know as you build, there will be. So are you going to talk a little bit about whether that, you talked about it's an either or with Ra and Tov. At some point, are you going to, just for the neophytes and the newbies, is it an either or?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I understand it, and we might all answer this differently of the Musar teachers, on this call, initially it can be helpful to think of it, for me, it was initially helpful to think of it as an either or. But you start seeing it, and CCM, Center for Contemporary Musar, has been wonderful just in its own thoughtful development of seeing it as, we only have one Yetzer, one kind of creative energy, and that it can either be Ra or it can be Tov. And we have different metaphors. I don't want to confuse people too much with too many different metaphorical universes, but I think the idea is to be, as we name it, in a kind of semi-permeable state. So there's Ra and Tov actually coexisting, because we do have to live in this world with boundaries. But we don't want the Yetzer Hara, for the purposes of I think what I'm wanting to say here, we don't want the Yetzer Hara to be the arbiter. We don't want the Yetzer Hara to be the Rosh Yeshiva, So I'm going to screen share again. We'll start looking at the Unatoneh Tokef prayer. And I wanted to go back we're going to get right to the heart of the prayer, but I want to go back because Rabbi Stone talked a little about this in our first session. And I felt like I wanted to recast and quote some of what he said in that first session. So this is how the prayer begins. And we could spend forever talking about different ways of translating this, but without getting mired necessarily in that way, we lend power, or we cede power, to the holiness of this day. Unatoneh Tokef Kedushat Hayom, for it is tremendous, it is awe-filled, and on this day, your kingship will be exalted. Your throne will be established in loving kindness, and you will sit on that throne in truth. So on the High Holy Days, the traditional language that we use is that God is being enthroned as king, and that we are enthroning God as king. The metaphors are problematic in more ways than we could name. So I don't want to get into it here. I want to paraphrase Rabbi Stone and say the force of the metaphor here is that we're identifying a locus of ultimate concern. We're saying this is central. This is what we're enthroning, so to speak, as what is most primary. And we're attesting, participating, witnessing, taking responsibility for something of central importance. And what is that? It's love. It's love. That this is, as you wouldn't think that when you think about the themes of the prayer, but it tells us very clearly here, Vayikon bechesed kisecha, and your throne is set in place by the power of love. And Rabbi Stone taught in the first session, and I'm going to quote here, this prayer is urging us to see that existence begins, and its beginning is mysterious, but it begins with the emergence of love. Undergirding the mystery is a sense that existence is moving towards goodness and love. And somehow, and this is what's sort of wild to wrap our minds and hearts around, we're responsible for that emergence. It's up to us to manifest that, even if it's the nature of the universe to move towards goodness and love. Rabbi Stone is always teaching through our engagement with Kabbalistic sources from the Jewish mystical tradition, that there's really this incredible humanism in how we read this. It's up to us the degree to which God or godliness will be manifest in the world. It's up to us to turn on the faucet. And the import of that, of course, is not for us, but it's for all beings, right? That we do it with that intention. So let's go on to the next slide. We'll go a little further in with this prayer. We're skipping one part right now, and we're getting right to sort of the middle part of the prayer. So I'm not going to read this, but for a lot of us, it's familiar. On Rosh Hashanah, it is inscribed. On Yom Kippur, it's sealed. And then the part that Leonard Cohen made famous, you know, if we hadn't heard it before. Who by fire, who by water, who by fire, who's going to live and who's going to die. So this is really the center of the prayer, gorgeously, poetically, chillingly, disturbingly. It seems to lay out a universe of almost total fatalism and determinism, where it doesn't seem like we have any agency, at least anymore. You know, we've acted, and now it's out of our hands. Our actions speak for themselves, and now we're passing, in the language of the traditional language, we're passing in front of the true judge who determines who shall live and who shall die. We feel the full weight of all that we can't or can no longer control. Then we get to the part of a prayer that we have been focusing on, that we have been reading and rereading through a Musar lens. And suddenly, this is really the turn, right? The volta. Suddenly, in the midst of the hopelessness and sense of total disempowerment, there's a crack of possibility, a but, you know, like in a movie where everything appears lost. This is sort of what I was picturing. And, you know, it seems hopeless, and the heroes and heroines are mired in whatever challenge, and it seems like there's no way out. And then someone says, well, there is one way out, but it's too crazy and impossible. It'll never work, you know, but we could try it. So it's like saying, but Teshuvah and Tefillah and Tzedakah. And here's the words that we're focusing on. Ma'avirin et ro'ah hagazera, Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah, roughly translated, right? Our rabbis before have done beautiful jobs of translating and unpacking them, but just for right now, right? Repentance or return, prayer or connection, righteous giving, acting justly, they avert the severe decree. So 7 words. I can't think of anything more Jewish than a 6-week course that averages just over 1 word per class. You know, we're really a crazy and wonderful people. What does it mean, the last part? Without getting too geeky and granular here in terms of the Hebrew grammar, and to give you a sense of the range, here are some of the different ways that it has been translated, just to give you an idea. Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah, ... I'll just give you a moment to look at that. You can see how not only how different the translations are, but how much it changes the theological thrust. I mean, they're different prayers. So I'll leave that up. Each word can be analyzed here, but for our purposes, I think the key distinction, or the one that I want to focus on, is avert the severe decree versus avert the severity of the decree. So in pre-modern translations, it was mostly read as avert the severe decree, but for theological reasons, this was more and more troubling to say, right? And I think we know why. If someone you love dies, with this translation, with what I'm calling the pre-modern one, avert the severe decree, there is an assumption that that person didn't do enough Teshuvah, Tefillah, or Tzedakah, right? Because the decree still stood. Just to note, the Unatoneh Tokef, we don't know exactly when it comes from, but probably medieval, maybe as early as the 6th century. So it's not from the Torah, it's not from the Talmud, but it riffs off of theology that predates it, like this well-known teaching from Masechet Rosh Hashanah, from the Talmud. And this gives you a sense, again, it'll be familiar, right? It's the imagery of the Book of Life. It'll be familiar about what's problematic, you know, in that pre-modern way of thinking about it, which isn't limited to the pre-modern, but just for a sense of naming it, right? We talk about the Book of Life and just paraphrasing what's there. Rabbi Yochanan, right, in his name, he teaches that there's these 3 books: the Book of Life for one who is wholly righteous, the Book of Death for one who is wholly wicked, and then for the rest of us, right, there's this sort of intermediate space. Middling people are left with their judgment suspended from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur, their fate remaining undecided. And the idea is that if we do enough Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah, we'll be written in the right book, and our loved ones will be written in the right book. But of course, we could do Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah till the cows come home, and sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes the wind blows another direction and the fires come your way, you know? So we are not the only ones who were troubled by this theology. Nachmanides, the Ramban from the 12th century, in a Rosh Hashanah sermon, he said, and I love this, he said, how could Rabbi Yochanan have said such a thing? Do all the righteous indeed live and the wicked die? Is not the world and all its desirable things given over to the wicked? Biblical verses cry out against Rabbi Yochanan. Has this sage never seen the book of Job? Okay, actually, we'll take a pause there. So I want to pause in just a moment for questions. I just want to say one more thing, and then we'll take a break if there are any questions or comments. The more modern or contemporary change to avert the severity of the decree then is it's actually truly grounded in the Hebrew. It's a more literal read. Although it's ambiguous, you can make a case either way. It's really 2 nouns, severity of the decree, and it seems like a small sort of nerdy change to focus on that. But when we make this change, we're saying in effect, nothing can change the decree itself. And let's even take away the language of decree, because that sounds like, you know, we could even just say this is just what it is to be a body. In a body is to be impermanent, right? Nothing can change that. But reading it like this, the severity of the decree, it changes the focus to, as Rabbi Helen Plotkin says, given the uncertainty, how are we to live? And and I'm going to unpack that more, but I want to pause now to see if there's questions or comments up to this point.
Well, there was one comment in the chat room where someone asked, you know, in the evolution of Judaism, should we be seeking out new non-hierarchical metaphors for the locus of our ultimate concern?
That's a great question. And I hit that wall sometimes, and I know that the rabbis will relate to this in some way, right? And the Jewish teachers also, you know, we kind of make our living peddling this idea that these metaphors it's worth staying with this metaphor, no matter how problematic it is. And plus it connects us ancestrally and to our tradition. And so therefore, like, we should hang in there and there will be fruit from this. And in some ways that we might not have ever imagined. But I do hit that wall where I will feel like I'm propping up year after year a metaphor that takes so long to just explain our way out of, that it's not, is it worth it? You know, so I think it's a real question. I think it's a good question to be asking.
Well, wonderful. I'm going to send some other questions your way right now that we've had. You know, there's one that just, what about bad luck? You know, that it has nothing to do with Teshuvah, Tzedakah. How do you deal with that, with the Unatoneh Tokef?
Yeah, well, there's this great famous Talmudic story where, you know, the rabbis are really concerned with it. They read the Torah and then they say, well, so how come bad things happen to good people? And it doesn't seem that there's rhyme or reason, the kind of order that we've been promised. They talk about, well, maybe they're rewarded in the world to come, or maybe, you know, maybe the reward is deferred. And they bring the story of a young boy who's sent by his father and he goes up I hope I'm not butchering the story. He gets a ladder, he goes up the ladder, he kind of shoos away the mother bird, and he takes the eggs back to his father. And there's like 3 mitzvahs in that. He's listening to his father, he's sparing the mother bird and not killing her also, you know, all of these things. But then the ladder breaks and he falls to his death. And the rabbis in the Talmud debate this. They just turn this over and over. And I don't know if this is the last point that's made, but to me it always feels like it. One of them says, maybe it was just a rickety ladder. And it pulls the rug out from under us in a way that I think we need to have that rug pulled out from under us. And actually, we don't need the Talmud to do that. Life will pull that rug out from under us, you know, when our order collapses and we feel like this, that is happening right now, whatever it is, wasn't supposed to happen. You know, and so we're left that. And I'm with you. It's close to my own read as far as what the questioner said.
So if you have time for a few more, there are a few more questions. Is it okay to keep going with a few?
Yeah.
Okay. So someone has asked whether, if you could really talk about the metaphor of around avert, and does it have anything to do with the emergence of love that Rabbi Stone talked about?
Well, even that word avert is bandied about. Like, is it avert? Is it? I think the most literal read of ma'avirin would be cause to pass, like cause to change. Like some people will wear, you know, they love this little verse in the Hebrew, gamze ya'avor, or gamze ya'avor, like also this will pass. And so I feel that in ma'avirin, that it's saying like also this will, whatever it is, it will all pass, in fact, you know. And maybe this is just one way we could connect it to what Rabbi Stone said in terms of love. Maybe we ask the question, like, after everything has passed, after things that we think of as good because they're good for our person or good for what we believe in, or things that we think of as bad because they are not good for us, our constricted way of seeing, after all of that has passed, what's left? Love, you know? So that's one way of responding. I imagine Rabbi Stone would bring other ways as well.
Well, there's one more question, and the question is, well, then how do you accept or explain your own success and happiness or worry if it can be taken away?
Well, I don't know if this is what the questioner had in mind. I think it can be anything can be taken away, you know, at any moment, and good or bad. You know, it's like that cliche when wherever you live, people have this like weather cliche where they say like, well, if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes, you know? And so I think what happens is, I mean, to me, this is where the Unatoneh Tokef brings me. And I remember Rabbi Stone, you saying, you know, the goal of this prayer, like the goal of a poem, it's not to solve it or to understand it even, but it's to experience it. So in the presence of the Unatoneh Tokef, I sort of feel like whatever my narrative has been in terms of constructing who I think I am and what has brought that into being, that life at one time or another smashes that, you know. So
yeah, it came
yeah.
I'm sorry, Joshua.
No, go ahead, Eddie.
You know, it came to me, you know, I was thinking about Arthur Ashe's autobiography, and when he wrote about, you know, when people asked him, aren't you angry and jealous about this transfusion and that you were taking for medical purposes, and did you ever just ask why? And he said, well, to ask why about that, I would have to ask why then about how did I become the first Black person to win Wimbledon, and that I don't just get to ask the why about the bad things.
It's beautiful.
That's what came to mind. I think there's one more question, and then you want to pick up on your, or do you want to pause and go back to what would work best for you?
Oh, we can do another question.
Okay, so if one thinks that the results of not being righteous, and what does that really mean, is death, what kind of a religious tradition are we following? Who would dare make these rules? And weren't these people who knew this was wrong from the minute this prayer was even written?
Wow, yeah, these are all such brilliant, huge questions that I think the prayer is designed to put us in touch with, just in a felt way. And there's obviously no right answer. I think like us, our ancestors strove to have, to want to discern an order, and that's a beautiful longing, like to find a Seder. That's right. It's one of our midot, order, like working with order, learning to work with order. Our ancestors wanted to find a way to identify that in what it might have felt like a meaningless universe. And so that longing, even if we don't like what they came up with, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan used to say this, we don't always like what the answer is, but if we go back and see what was the question that made them come up with that answer, that we can often relate with, that longing to have an order. And also, I think for some people, just to go really directly into the prayer, the Unatoneh Tokef, when we hear, hey, we're all in the middle book, and it's Teshuvah and Tefillah and Tzedakah, and there's a chance that could have an impact, that whether that's dread or inspiration, for some of us, we might feel that that's inspiring. And that's going to inspire us to go out and change our lives for the better in a way of being of service, whether it's out of fear or inspiration. Some of us might just be disturbed by the metaphor and not get to that place.
I don't want to overlook a beautiful question, which is, I wonder about this focus on the severity as opposed to the possibility of sweetness. And in your reading, what's the importance of focusing on the severity of the decree as opposed to how to have the fruit?
Well, that's beautiful. I think in a way, not to dodge that question, but I do think it relates to the last things that I want to talk about and reflect back some of the, from Rabbi Kravitz and Rabbi Bovitz and Rabbi Kamras to bring back in some of what they taught and hopefully indirectly respond to that question, and then we'll have one other time for questions before we conclude.
Make sure we loop back on it.
Yeah, great, awesome. Okay, so through this lens of transforming the severity of the decree, meaning, and this is what I mean by it, like at this moment, meaning changing our conditioned response to our relationship to when we get afraid and when we tighten up, when we go to the Yetzer Hara, right? And so how do we change this conditioned response, particularly maybe when we're confronted with mortality, but it can be anytime we're afraid. So let's look again at Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah and ask, these are sort of like, I would say there are three practices that we are being given by the ancients. And if you think about it, it's such a gift. We always say in Judaism, people complain, they didn't, bequeath to us any practices. We have all the thought, but what do we actually do? And it's like, these are three practices, three ways that the Yetzer HaTov is activated. Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah, and they help us turn on the faucet. Three ways that instead of shutting down in the grip of anxiety, they help us to choose to involve ourselves in the lives of others and see beyond our narrow self-definition. Or they help us have a semi-permeable stance, to go back to what we were saying earlier. So these are just three ways of kind of looking at that. So one, Rabbi Kamras brought forth some words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel on Tefillah. Something that Rabbi Heschel teaches is that prayer should be subversive. Prayer should seek to change the status quo. You can think about it that the status quo is seeing the world from a Yetzer Hara perspective. So like Tefillah, I also think Teshuvah and Tzedakah also, when they're done rightly, and I think of what Rabbi Kravitz was bringing last week, really challenging us, they're also subversive when we do them right. They also upend the status quo of our self-absorption and our debilitating fear. And one of the definitions of Teshuvah that Rabbi Boettiger brought is that it helps us change course. We readjust and ask, what am I centering on? We turn away from the pain of our selfish worldview, turning towards the other. And she said, we're working with not just outer, obvious sins, but thoughts that we believe that enforce bad character traits. And all of these place us and our personality at the center of the universe. One thing that Dr. Boettiger has taught that all of us go back to is sharing this moment that all of us who teach Musar and have learned from her go back to this moment of when she said, I thought that my Yetzer Hara was like, and I'm paraphrasing, I hope I don't get it too wrong, I thought it was the best part of my personality. But then you see, oh, all of our personalities are these ways of, that we've taught to like often, be defended around what's painful to us. And so the Teshuvah, in the spirit of how Rabbi Boettiger brought it, is it recenters us, and we're not who we thought we were. And likewise, Rabbi Kravitz taught that Tzedakah reminds us that it's not about us. It recenters us on looking for God in the face of the other, as he taught in invoking Levinas. It's all a corrective to what we often do with this prayer. And remember, those of you who were in the first session, when Rabbi Stone said, if we read this prayer literally, and some of the questions come right from this place, I mean, rightly challenging it, we're treating God as a puppet who checks boxes and rewards and punishes. So all of these practices help shift our central focus to identifying the divine and the one sitting next to us in the pew. A Musar Reed of Unatoneh Tokef says, create the neural pathways of Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah until you can have this stance in the world more reliably. So this is, I like thinking of Musar, Rabbi Stone said it's always a Elul for the Musar practitioner, always this month where we're doing this kind of inner and outer work. And so Musar, I like thinking of it. It's helped me a lot preparing this talk to think about, okay, I'm gonna have these three gifts, Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah, year round to help me take this semi-permeable stance in the world more reliably. All three are subversive, and all three dislodge our normal ways of thinking and behaving. The second thing is, we often say the medium is the message. And maybe the most important thing about Unatoneh Tokef that we'll be challenged by this year is that usually we're surrounded by others when we hear this prayer, right? This year, often it'll be just us or us and another person facing our computer screen. Usually, I think we really have this sense, as awesome and challenging and scary as this is, we're experiencing it together, literally and figuratively. And I think for me, like one of the things that feels most painful about suffering in general is I often will think there's a shame with it. Like I'll think I'm the only one who's suffering in this way, exactly like this. And so when we hear this prayer with our brothers and sisters, like shoulder to shoulder, and then also, going forward and looking back, there's some sense that the very thing that divided us from others, which is often our fear, right? Our terror, becomes, when we take it in this way, it becomes connective. The thing that separated us from others becomes that which connects us because we can't practice Musar alone. This prayer reminds us powerfully that we're doing this life together. We often will say that there's a third way in Musar. Usually human beings, when faced with the weight of the world and all of the suffering in it, we either take it on our shoulders and burn out, or we go to sleep to our responsibilities because it's too much. The third way is to know that we share this work with all beings. So I want to screen share here and then say one more thing and then open it up for more questions just before we conclude. This is from Ecclesiastes Rabbah, a midrash on the book of Ecclesiastes. It was taught in the name of Rabbi Meir, when one comes into the world, his hands are clenched, as if to say, the whole world is mine and I will inherit it. And when one takes leave of the world, his hands are open, as if to say, I have not taken from this world a single thing. So one way, this last way that I was thinking of Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah as transformational practices that change how we see the world, that change us, change, turning towards others. These are all giving away practices. These are all practices that take us from like clenching our hands to opening them. Teshuvah, you take responsibility for something and then you leave it, right? You drop it. You don't pick it up again, ideally. Tefillah, when we pray, and Rabbi Kamras really spoke to this, we give ourselves away to God. That's one of the meanings of prayer, avodah, like an offering. It's an act of sacrifice, a giving away of ourselves. One of my favorite lines in that spirit from any poet is Wendell Berry. At the end of one of his poems, he says, every day you have less and less reason not to give yourself away. Every day you have less and less reason not to give yourself away. And of course, with Tzedakah, most visibly and obviously, we give away our resources. And so Musar is a practice of learning to open the hands now and not waiting until we die. So lastly, Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah. And I'm saying these words so often, they almost feel like three wise men, or the, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. They feel like they have a personality at this point. Lastly, they're imaginative practices that help us imagine a different world. And we come back around to the Jane Kenyon poem in a different way. We practice Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah to help make ourselves and the world otherwise. And I'm paraphrasing Norman Fisher here, and then I'll screen share the last part of his comment. But what Norman says, and he's a Zen priest, Zen abbot of the Green Gulch Zen Center for years, and also he was the best friend of Rabbi Alan Liu of blessed memory, a conservative rabbi, and they did a lot of Buddhist Jewish meditation stuff together in the Bay Area. And Norman's very committed to Judaism, and anyway, he brings this. He says, whoever we are, right, we're all aware of the world beyond our households now. Through how could you duck the ubiquitous news media? And he calls it, I love this definition, he says the news media has become our collective nervous system. It's become our collective nervous system, twitching our attention with constant jolts of true and false information about political, environmental, economic, and social problems. And they become the stuff of our psyches and conversations. And we don't know where we end off, and that all begins. And in the presence of that, these underlying questions, which we might actually stop and feel on the high holy days, but are there all the time. What will the future bring? Asked Norman. What's the world going to be like for our children and grandchildren? Will there be a world? Dread fills the air. Sometimes we feel it, mostly we don't let ourselves feel it. It's too much. What can we really do about it? And then this is the last part of his statement. I am convinced that the world could be and actually is otherwise, that its possibilities need not be and actually aren't limited to the tangible, the knowable, the negotiable, to the data we are constantly collecting about practically everything measurable. Data gives us the illusion that we know the world, but the world is more than we know. So it's a different, right? We're back to Jane Kenyon's poem. How do you live into this sense that one day it will be otherwise, one day we won't be here? To coming eye to eye with our impermanence. And that language kind of comes all the way around. It's not just the imaginative terror but the imaginative, the fruitfulness of who we might be, and how we might see our lot more tied up with the lot of others. So 80 is actually, before I say the concluding, just a brief remark, we'll see if there's any more questions.
Yes, there are, Rabbi. So, someone asks, is this prayer really a Musar prayer, in that it's a list of do's and don'ts, which is sort of the kibush practice in our lives? Sometimes we need to be told we're getting it wrong because we're behaving like children. So the answer is very black and white, which is this prayer. But then as we move on with our practice and we begin a tikkun practice, as we mature, we understand the prayer is about the other and how we must make haste to love the other, to serve the other while there's still time.
I love that. Yeah, amen. Amen. And I think we're always saying with Musar, we're all biased. We think Musar is the greatest thing since sliced bread and everybody should be doing it. But we don't say, oh yeah, Musar is this sort of sidebar in Jewish tradition. We say, actually, there is this particular Musar tradition, but it's really the heart of Judaism. It's not other than that. Rabbi Stone often will teach that the rabbis weren't as, they understood metaphor and poetry more than we give them credit for. So maybe they didn't see it as black and white as the prayer seems like. Maybe they understood that this was a way to draw people in. And then we're back to what a previous questioner said, do we need a new metaphor? And I think the answer to that is maybe, or maybe this and, I don't know. But I love what the last questioner said in terms of, we start with this real self-focus, who will live and who will die? Am I gonna live? Am I gonna die? What about my mother, my father? What's this year gonna hold? And then something through Teshuvah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah cracks us open, so that it's not just about our own, even though it's a very legitimate concern about that personally, it cracks us open to a concern for the other, that not only we take on that responsibility or we recognize it, but it brings joy and kind of relief to having to hold it so tightly ourselves. I don't know if that speaks to it, but.
And does that loop back to what we were going to talk about severity versus sweetness, that you were going to come back to?
Yeah. Well, the end part of the prayer, I think, we're not going to have time to talk about it now, but to me, maybe Rabbi Stone will speak about it next week, but to me, it's a lot of these images of even more, it's softer, maybe sweeter, maybe not, but it's softer, instead of just who will die by strangulation and who will die by asphyxiation. It's easy to be softer than that, whatever follows. But it really talks about, it's not just like this for human beings. We're all dust, from dust to dust. And there's something kind of comforting in that. We're fragile. We're fragile as pottery. Now I'm quoting from it. So easily shattered, like the grass that withers or the flowers that fade, or like a fleeting shadow or like a cloud across the sky. And those aren't necessarily comforting images, but sometimes it's like when you stand under a starry sky, there is a feeling of annihilation, but there's also this feeling of, whoa, I'm so much smaller than I thought I was, and that there's a comfort in that. There's like a relief in that, and maybe a sweetness in that. So maybe the sweetness comes that way. Maybe the sweetness comes from more involving ourselves in the lives of others, and seeing our fates intertwined and not just being, constricted in the way that we usually are.
So before we wrap up, Joshua, I'm just curious, as you're surrounded by fire and COVID, are you going to be reading this prayer differently this year, this Yantiv?
I'm sure I will. I do, and I know we all do every year. I mean, this is an intense day that we're in the midst of out here. It felt like Adi and I were talking, do we want to, like, maybe we should postpone, you know, it's really intense, and then the needs of the community, and just, this is like real life. But it's like, this is what's happening all the time. You know, we take our turn wherever we live, or whoever we are, we take our turn. But it's like, so it's a powerful day to just like be wrestling with this prayer together. And I'm sure it'll bring me, I don't know how, but into the season in a way that is different, but I don't yet know how.
Mm-hmm. That's all the questions here. So did you want to wrap, and then I'll do a brief closing?
Yeah, well, I just want to thank everybody for being part of the call. And like I think all of us have said, it's not, we prefer to see everybody in an ideal world, and to be looking at each other and not lecturing so much. But I'm grateful for this, and grateful for learning from you know, my 4 teachers before, and grateful to work together on this. 80, my you know, friend, and that we could do this. Thank you for being part of it, and thank you, Isha, and I want to just say, Rabbi Stone is going to be, 80 will say this, but please join us next week. Rabbi Stone who launched these last 5 weeks of learning, is going to bring us home, and there's last slide I'll leave you with, and not only reminds you that before turning it over to 80, that Rabbi Stone will be teaching next week, but this quote by the poet G.C. Waldrep, and I'm thinking of Unatoneh Tokef in this way: a prayer poem is an ark. It is a vessel that carries a message across a void. And if that's the case, you know, may the message that each of us, you know, feel or imagine or understand from Unatoneh Tokef this year, may it be a fruitful one in terms of just bringing us towards enrichment and to one another.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Just a couple of things, but I just want to say that in my gratitude practice, I will be thinking about this tonight, and it will deepen my gratitude for Musar and for all my teachers. So thank you once again. Just a couple of last minute logistical things. One other thing, Rabbi. Someone wanted to make sure that you knew that we recognized it was your birthday on top of everything else. So this probably wasn't the way you envisioned your birthday, but there will be other celebrations. So
yeah, there's going to be an ice cream cake right afterwards here.
Right, so. Right. So lastly, I just want to remind everyone that, as Joshua said, Rabbi Stone is the bookends. He's the one side and the other side to the series, and he will be here to close out our little study together. If you'd like to go back to the archives, or you'd like to learn more about the offerings that CCM has, I want to remind you that the website is contemporarymusar.org. And if also there's a donate button, you feel free to go ahead and donate. We'll be donating this year around all sorts of causes and issues and things we value and cherish. So again, thank you all. Blessings, as we all try to stay safe and healthy and present for each other.